This is a short lecture just to explain the basics of your camera's shutter, how it works and what it does. You can think of the shutter in your camera as a bit like a window shutter. You open up the shutters to let more light in, and you close the shutters to cut out the light. When you open and then close the shutters, the room gets brighter for a brief period and then gets darker again. That's quite obvious to anyone over the age of about 2. But that's pretty much what a camera does on your SLR or mirrorless camera. I'll show you in more detail on my old film camera. I'll just open the back up so you can see in more detail. You can't do that on a digital camera. Now, this is the curtain type fabric, which is the actual shutter. If I set the shutter to stay open for a certain amount of time, slow enough for you to see, the mirror pops up, which by the way gives that familiar clunk sound. The shutter opens and then closes to let in an amount of light for a certain duration. Now, that was a very slow shutter speed, which in the majority of cases would let in too much light. The faster the shutter speed, the less light gets in. So I'm going to switch to a typical faster shutter speed, say 250th of a second. You can hear the much faster speed, but I doubt you could even see the shutter opening and closing. Let's take a look at the actual shutter speed values used for most photos. The shutter speed is a fraction of a second. Now, generally speaking, out in the bright sunlight, it could be anywhere between 125th of a second and several thousandths of a second, depending on other camera settings like your aperture or ISO. In low light, the shutter speed might be somewhere between, say, 30th of a second and 125th of a second. And at night, taking a night scene, or maybe fireworks, say, the shutter speed can be several seconds. Obviously at night, the shutter needs to be held open for longer to let more light in, to give a good exposure. As you go down this chart, you'll notice that the actual speed values are doubling up. So 500th of a second is twice as fast as 125th of a second, and 30th of a second lets in twice as much light as 60th of a second. Each of these shutter speeds is sometimes referred to as a stop. So going up a stop might mean changing the shutter speed from 250th of a second to 125th of a second to let more light in. But it could also mean changing the aperture from f5.6 to f4, again to let in more light. And that's all there is to it. Obviously, the shutter speed is used primarily to help control the exposure, but it also has a creative aspect to it. I'm talking about controlling motion, but I'll be covering that in another lecture. See you then.